The morning sun cast long shadows across the elite sniper training facility at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her scope for the 100th time, her weathered hands steady despite the early hour. 9 of the military's finest marksmen had already failed the impossible shot. The target sat 3,800 meters away, a distance that pushed the very limits of human capability and technology. The observation deck buzzed with tension as high-ranking officers from every branch of the military watched through binoculars. General Harrison, a man who had seen 3 decades of warfare, stood with his arms crossed, his face grim. This wasn't just another training exercise. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had positioned a high-value target at extreme range, and conventional artillery couldn't reach the location without causing massive civilian casualties. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been the first to attempt the shot 3 hours earlier. His reputation preceded him, over 200 confirmed kills in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Argentine-born marksman had earned his stripes in the mountains of Kandahar, where he once eliminated 3 insurgent leaders from 2,100 meters in a single operation. But the morning wind had caught his bullet, sending it wide by 18 inches. Next came Captain Thompson from the Marines, a legend who had held the Corps' longest confirmed kill record for 7 years. His shot had been perfect in calculation, compensating for the Coriolis effect, wind drift, and bullet drop with mathematical precision. Yet somehow, the round fell short by mere feet, embedding in the dirt berm just below the target. The failure of each subsequent shooter sent ripples of unease through the observation deck. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Master Sergeant Chun had survived 4 tours in Iraq and had never missed a shot that mattered. Sergeant Major Williams had trained half the snipers currently serving in special operations. Captain Brooks had taken out insurgent leaders from rooftops in Baghdad that other snipers said were impossible shots. One by one, they approached the firing line with confidence born of years of experience, only to watch their bullets miss by margins that defied explanation. The wind readings were consistent. The equipment was flawless. The mathematics were sound. Yet something about this particular distance seemed to mock their expertise. Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked silently through the crowd, her presence barely noticed among the gathered officers and trainers. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she possessed an unremarkable appearance that had served her well throughout her career. No one looked twice at the quiet woman in Navy utilities who carried herself with understated confidence. She had been observing each attempt, taking mental notes of wind patterns, bullet trajectory, and the subtle environmental factors that the other shooters might have overlooked. While they focused on the technical aspects, she studied the bigger picture. The facility sat in a valley where mountain winds created unpredictable air currents. The early morning temperature differential between the sunny firing line and the shaded target area would affect bullet flight in ways that standard ballistic charts couldn't predict. General Harrison's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "Gentlemen, we're running out of options. This mission launches in 72 hours, and we need someone who can make this shot under combat conditions. If our best can't do it in perfect training conditions, how can we expect success in the field?" The assembled snipers exchanged glances, their pride wounded but their professionalism intact. Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Thompson checked his rifle for the 3rd time, searching for some mechanical explanation for his failure. The weight of expectation pressed down on them all. Colonel Matthews, the facility commander, stepped forward with a clipboard full of names. "Sir, we have 3 more qualified marksmen we can call in from Quantico. Gunnery Sergeant Davis has been shooting competitively for 15 years. Staff Sergeant Murphy just returned from a successful deployment where he eliminated 13 high-value targets." "Time is what we don't have, Colonel," Harrison replied, his frustration evident. "Every hour we delay gives the enemy more time to relocate their asset. We need results now." Sarah Chun had heard enough. She stepped forward from the crowd, her movement fluid and purposeful. "General, request permission to attempt the shot." The observation deck fell silent. Harrison turned to study the woman who had spoken, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "And you are?" "Lieutenant Sarah Chun, sir. Navy SEAL Team 6, designated marksman." Her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone lean in to listen. Rodriguez let out a barely audible snort. With respect, Lieutenant, this isn't a game. 9 of us have already tried, and we've got more experience between us than most entire units. Sarah's expression remained neutral. Yes, Sergeant. I watched every attempt. Thompson stepped closer, his tone not unkind but clearly skeptical. Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect, but this shot is pushing the absolute limits of what's possible. The conditions are perfect, the equipment is flawless, and every one of us has made similar shots in combat. If we can't do it, then maybe you're approaching it wrong, Sarah replied simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison studied her face, looking for signs of arrogance or recklessness. Instead, he saw the calm confidence of someone who had faced death repeatedly and emerged victorious. What's your longest confirmed kill, Lieutenant? 3,400 meters, sir. Fallujah, 2019. Several of the snipers turned to look at her with new interest. That was a serious distance, one that put her in very exclusive company. But 3,800 meters was still 400 meters beyond even that exceptional shot. Captain Brooks spoke up. What makes you think you can succeed where we failed? Sarah's eyes moved to the distant target, then back to the mountains surrounding the facility. Because I don't think the problem is with your shooting, sir. I think it's with your assumptions. General Harrison made his decision. Very well, Lieutenant. You have one attempt. If you miss, we'll have to recommend against the mission. As Sarah walked toward the firing line, she could hear whispered conversations behind her. Some questioned whether this was just political correctness run amok. Others wondered if the pressure had finally gotten to the general's judgment. A few recognized her name from classified after-action reports and fell silent. She knelt beside the massive rifle, a Barrett M82A1 capable of sending a .50 caliber round across impossible distances. The weapon had been perfectly zeroed by the previous shooters, its scope calibrated to mathematical precision. But, as Sarah settled into position, she made adjustments that seemed to contradict everything the others had calculated. The wind meter read a steady 5 miles per hour from the east. Every previous shooter had compensated accordingly. But Sarah watched the grass at different points along the bullet's path, noting variations that the instruments couldn't detect. She observed how heat shimmer rose from different sections of ground, creating thermals that would affect trajectory in minute but crucial ways. Most importantly, she noticed something that the others had overlooked entirely. The target sat on a slight rise, and the morning sun was beginning to heat the metal framework holding it in place. That heat was creating an almost invisible updraft that would lift a bullet at the last second, causing it to hit high and wide. Sarah made her final adjustments and settled into the perfect shooting position. Her breathing slowed to a steady rhythm. Her heartbeat calmed to the point where she could fire between beats. The gathered crowd held its breath as she took aim at a target so distant it was barely visible even through the powerful scope. The shot had to be perfect, not just for the mission, but to prove that sometimes the quiet ones had been watching and learning while others assumed they knew everything. In the military, reputation was earned one shot at a time, and this shot would either make her career or end it before most people even knew she existed. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she controlled her breathing. Through the scope, the target appeared as a small dark circle against the distant hillside. At 3,800 meters, even the slightest tremor would send the bullet completely off course. She had learned this level of control during her darkest days in SEAL training, when instructors pushed her past every limit she thought she had. The memory surfaced unbidden as she steadied her aim. Hell Week had nearly broken her, not because of the physical demands, but because of the constant whispers that she didn't belong. Chen will quit by Wednesday, she had overheard one instructor telling another. They always do when the real pressure starts. Those words had burned in her mind as she endured sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and physical exhaustion that left grown men sobbing. But she hadn't quit. When her boat crew struggled to carry their rubber raft over endless sand dunes, she had grabbed extra weight without being asked. When other candidates collapsed during surf torture, she helped them stand. By the end of training, those same instructors who had bet against her were recommending her for advanced sniper school. The wind shifted slightly, and Sarah made a microscopic adjustment to her scope. She had noticed something during the previous attempts that the other shooters had missed. The facility sat in a unique geographical position where 3 different wind patterns converged. The meteorological instruments only measured wind at the firing line, but Sarah had observed grass, dust patterns, and heat shimmer at various points along the bullet's path. At 1,200 meters, a crosswind from the north would catch the bullet. At 2,400 meters, the terrain created a Venturi effect that would accelerate the round slightly. And, at the target itself, the rising sun was heating the metal framework, creating an updraft that would lift the bullet at the last crucial moment. General Harrison shifted nervously behind her. "Lieutenant, you're taking longer than the others. Is there a problem?" "No problem, sir. Just making sure I understand the environment completely." Sarah's voice was calm, almost conversational. She had learned years ago that confidence wasn't about being loud or aggressive. True confidence was quiet, steady, and absolutely certain. The story of her first combat kill had become legend in certain circles, though few knew her name was attached to it. A terrorist leader had taken position in a minaret 2,100 meters away, directing mortar fire against an American convoy trapped in an urban canyon. The target appeared only for seconds at a time between concrete pillars, making the shot nearly impossible. 3 male snipers had attempted to eliminate the target over the course of an hour. Each had failed, their bullets striking stone and mortar but never flesh. Meanwhile, American soldiers were dying in the street below as enemy mortars found their range. The situation was becoming desperate when Sarah asked for permission to attempt the shot. "Let the lady try," the unit commander had said with obvious skepticism. "Can't get worse than it already is." Sarah had studied the target's pattern for 20 minutes, timing his appearances to the second. She noted that he favored his left side when peering around the pillar, exposing himself for exactly 2.3 seconds every time. When she finally fired, the bullet traveled for nearly 3 seconds through space, arriving just as the terrorist leaned out for his next observation. The shot had been perfect, but the aftermath was what shaped her approach to leadership. Instead of celebrating, Sarah had quietly cleaned her rifle and prepared for the next mission. The other snipers, initially resentful, began asking her opinion on difficult shots. She never lectured or criticized, but she shared observations that made them better marksmen. Now, lying behind the Barrett rifle with 9 failed attempts weighing on everyone's minds, Sarah applied those same principles. She wasn't here to prove anything or show up her colleagues. She was here to solve a problem that needed solving. The crosshairs settled on the target with mechanical precision. Sarah had calculated her adjustments using formulas that went beyond standard ballistic charts. She accounted for the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation, the decreased air density at the target's elevation, and the gradual warming of the barrel from previous shots. But, most crucially, she had factored in the human element that computers couldn't calculate. The previous shooters had all aimed for the center of the target, following conventional wisdom. But Sarah had noticed that the metal framework supporting the target was slightly bent, causing it to hang at a barely perceptible angle. What appeared to be center mass was actually 3 inches off true center. Her breathing slowed to the point where her heartbeat became audible in her own ears. She had learned to fire between heartbeats, in that perfect moment when her body was completely still. The technique had taken years to master, requiring a level of body awareness that bordered on meditation. Behind her, the assembled crowd had fallen completely silent. Even Rodriguez, who had been skeptical minutes earlier, found himself holding his breath. There was something about Chin's stillness that commanded respect. She didn't fidget, didn't adjust, and readjust her position like some of the others had. Once she settled into her shooting stance, she became as motionless as the rifle itself. Sergeant Major Williams, who had trained dozens of snipers over his career, recognized what he was seeing. "That's a shooter," he whispered to Thompson. "Look at her form. Look at her breathing control. She's not just aiming. She's become part of the weapon system." Sarah's finger took up the slack in the trigger. The Barrett's trigger broke clean at exactly 4 pounds of pressure, a weight she knew by heart. In the fraction of a second before the firing pin struck the primer, her mind completed final calculations that accounted for variables too subtle for instruments to measure. The morning air was warming, which would affect powder burn rate. The rifle barrel had cooled slightly since the last shot, changing the harmonics of vibration as the bullet traveled down the bore. The target itself might have shifted microscopically on its framework due to thermal expansion of the metal supports. All of these factors existed in the space between her decision to fire and the bullet's departure from the muzzle. In that moment, Sarah became more than just a marksman. She became a human ballistic computer, processing information at levels that separated good shooters from legendary ones. The trigger broke with a crisp snap, and the Barrett thundered across the valley. The massive rifle's recoil drove straight back into Sarah's shoulder, but her body absorbed it without movement. Through the scope, she tracked the bullet's path as much by instinct as by sight. For nearly 4 seconds, the round flew through space at 2,800 feet per second. It rose along its parabolic arc, reached its apex at nearly 400 feet above the firing line, then began its descent toward the distant target. At 2,100 meters, it encountered the first crosswind and drifted slightly east. At 2,400 meters, the Venturi effect accelerated it through a gap between hills. And at 3,800 meters, as the bullet approached its target, Sarah's calculations proved correct. The updraft from the heated metal framework lifted the bullet exactly as she had predicted. But because she had aimed low to compensate, the round struck precisely where it was intended. The distant crack of impact echoed across the valley a full second after the muzzle blast had faded. Through binoculars and spotting scopes, the assembled crowd watched as the target spun on its mount, a perfect hole punched through its center. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, General Harrison slowly lowered his binoculars, a look of amazement spreading across his weathered face. "Outstanding, Lieutenant. Absolutely outstanding." The silence that followed the perfect shot stretched for several heartbeats before erupting into controlled celebration. Sarah remained in position, watching through her scope as the target continued to spin slowly on its damaged mount. She had learned early in her career that the shot was only the beginning of the mission, not the end. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to approach, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional respect. "Ma'am, I've been shooting for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone read conditions like that. Would you mind explaining what you saw that we missed?" Sarah finally lifted her head from the scope and sat back on her heels. The wind readings were accurate at ground level, but the bullet path crossed 3 different atmospheric zones. The instruments couldn't account for the thermal dynamics created by the terrain. Captain Thompson knelt beside the rifle, studying the scope adjustments she had made. "These calculations, you're compensating for variables that aren't even in the manual. Where did you learn this approach?" "Trial and error mostly, and a lot of time studying meteorology during deployments." Sarah began the methodical process of clearing the rifle, her movements precise and automatic. When you're operating in environments where a missed shot means friendly casualties, you learn to read everything the environment tells you. General Harrison approached the group, his expression mixing admiration with curiosity. "Lieutenant, your service record is classified above my clearance level, but I'm beginning to understand why. How many operations have you been involved in?" "I can't discuss specifics, sir, but I've been deployed continuously for the past 6 years. Most of that time in advisory roles where precision shooting was critical to mission success." Sarah's tone remained professional, giving nothing away about the dozens of operations that had taken her from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Syria. What she didn't mention were the nights spent alone on rooftops in Baghdad, providing overwatch for special operations teams moving through hostile neighborhoods, or the time she had spent 36 hours in a hide site in the mountains of Pakistan, waiting for a single shot that would prevent a terrorist attack on American soil. Colonel Matthews stepped forward, his clipboard forgotten. "Lieutenant, I'm curious about your training background. Most snipers take years to develop this level of environmental awareness. How long have you been shooting competitively?" "I started hunting with my grandfather when I was 7, sir. He was a Marine sniper in Vietnam, and he taught me that shooting was only half the skill. The other half was understanding wind, light, temperature, and terrain." Sarah's voice softened slightly as she mentioned her grandfather, the only person who had never doubted her ability to succeed in a male-dominated field. Master Sergeant Chun, who shared her surname but no relation, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Ma'am, what made you notice the thermal effect at the target when none of us did? Sarah considered her answer carefully. The truth was that she had developed an almost intuitive sense for environmental factors that couldn't be taught from textbooks. It had come from years of operating in conditions where textbook solutions got people killed. During a deployment in Syria, I had to take a shot at 2,800 meters where the target was positioned next to a burning building. The heat created updrafts that made conventional calculations useless. I learned that metal structures, especially when heated by direct sunlight, create thermal columns that can affect bullet trajectory in the final 100 meters. She paused, remembering that particular shot. A high-value target had been directing attacks on a refugee camp from a building that couldn't be bombed without massive civilian casualties. Sarah had spent 8 hours in position, waiting for the wind and thermal conditions to align perfectly for a single-shot opportunity. The key is to observe the entire bullet path, not just the conditions at your position, she continued. I watched how heat shimmer moved at different distances, noted variations in grass movement, and factored in the thermal mass of the target framework. Sergeant Major Williams nodded slowly. He had been skeptical when Sarah first requested to attempt the shot, but now he understood why the Navy had assigned her to SEAL Team 6. Ma'am, would you be willing to conduct some training sessions for our advanced students? This kind of environmental awareness isn't something we currently teach. Of course, Sergeant Major. Knowledge that saves lives should be shared. Sarah finished cleaning the rifle and began packing her equipment. Her movements were economical and professional, displaying none of the showmanship that sometimes accompanied exceptional marksmanship. General Harrison pulled out his secure phone. Lieutenant, I'm calling Washington immediately. The mission is approved, and I'm recommending that you take the shot when we deploy. This target has been directing attacks against our forces for 6 months, and conventional approaches have failed repeatedly. Sarah's expression grew serious. Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but a successful training shot doesn't guarantee success in combat conditions. The operational environment will include factors we can't replicate here, such as hostile fire, time pressure, equipment that may not be perfectly zeroed, and environmental conditions that could change rapidly. The target will also likely have security measures in place that could complicate the approach and egress. Harrison studied her face, recognizing the voice of hard-earned experience. Lieutenant, your modesty is admirable, but your record speaks for itself. Intel reports indicate this target follows a predictable pattern, appearing at a specific location every morning at 0630 local time. The range will be approximately 3,900 meters, with clear lines of sight from 2 possible firing positions. Sarah absorbed the details while continuing to pack her gear. 100 meters beyond the training distance, with the added stress of combat conditions and a moving target. The margin for error would be virtually non-existent. What's the backup plan if the shot fails, sir? There isn't one. The target's security has been increased dramatically in recent weeks. This may be our only opportunity to eliminate him without significant collateral damage. Harrison's tone carried the weight of command decisions that affected thousands of lives. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice lowered. Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, how do you handle the pressure of shots like this? I've been in combat for 8 years, but knowing that everything depends on one bullet still gets to me. Sarah looked at him with understanding. The pressure never goes away, Sergeant. But I've learned that pressure can either freeze you or focus you. The key is to trust your training and remember that you're not shooting for yourself. You're shooting for every friendly soldier who will be safer if the target is eliminated. She had learned that lesson during her first deployment, when a failed shot had resulted in an IED attack that wounded 3 Marines. The guilt had nearly destroyed her confidence until an older sniper taught her to channel that emotion into motivation rather than self-doubt. Captain Brooks raised a point that had been bothering him. Ma'am, the intelligence report mentions that this target has survived multiple assassination attempts. He's reportedly very aware of sniper threats and only exposes himself for brief periods. How do you prepare for a shot when you might only have seconds to acquire and engage? By being ready before the opportunity presents itself, Sarah replied. In urban environments, I've learned to preposition on likely target locations and wait for the subject to appear. When you only have a 2 or 3-second window, there's no time to range the target or calculate windage. Everything has to be ready before he shows himself. Thompson whistled softly. That kind of patience must be incredibly difficult to maintain, especially under stress. It is. But it's also why snipers are selected for psychological stability as much as marksmanship ability. Anyone can learn to hit a target at distance given enough time and perfect conditions. The real skill is maintaining performance when conditions are far from perfect. General Harrison checked his watch. Lieutenant, I want you on a transport to Bagram Airfield within 6 hours. This mission has been planned for weeks, but we've been waiting for confirmation that someone could make the shot. Your demonstration today just provided that confirmation. As the group began to disperse, Sarah reflected on the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In less than 72 hours, she would be in position for a shot that could change the course of operations in an entire theater. Success would save countless lives. Failure would not only mean continuation of enemy attacks, but would also reflect on the capabilities of female operators in combat roles. She had faced similar pressure before, but never with so many people watching and so much depending on a single bullet. The training shot had been perfect, but combat had a way of making perfection nearly impossible to achieve. 48 hours later, Sarah lay motionless in a carefully constructed hide site overlooking the Khost province in Afghanistan. The rocky outcropping provided perfect concealment while offering clear lines of sight to the target building 3,900 meters away. She had been in position for 14 hours, arriving under cover of darkness to avoid detection by enemy patrols. The intelligence briefing had been thorough but sobering. The target, known only as the engineer, was responsible for designing the sophisticated IEDs that had killed over 200 coalition forces in the past year. He operated from a compound that served as both his workshop and residence, appearing briefly each morning on a balcony overlooking the valley. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, her spotter and security element, lay beside her with a high-powered scope trained on the approach routes. Webb had worked with Sarah on 6 previous operations and understood her methods better than anyone. Their partnership had been forged through months of dangerous missions where split-second communication meant the difference between success and disaster. Target building shows no movement, Webb whispered into his microphone. Security patrol passed the north checkpoint 12 minutes ago, right on schedule. Sarah made minute adjustments to her rifle scope, compensating for the morning temperature differential. The Afghan mountains created challenging shooting conditions, with unpredictable wind patterns and extreme temperature swings between night and day. She had studied weather reports for the region going back 3 months, identifying patterns that would affect bullet trajectory. The rifle she carried was a custom-built system based on the Chetak M200 platform, capable of sending a .408 caliber round accurately at extreme distances. Every component had been hand-selected and precision-tuned by military armorers who understood that a sniper's weapon was more than just a tool. It was a precision instrument that could determine the outcome of entire operations. "Sarah, we've got movement in the compound," Webb reported, his voice remaining calm despite the tension. 2 guards on the roof, 1 vehicle approaching from the east. Through her scope, Sarah could see the compound clearly despite the distance. The building was 3 stories tall, constructed of concrete and stone typical of the region. The target balcony was on the 2nd floor, offering whoever stood there a commanding view of the surrounding valley. It was both a strategic advantage and a vulnerability. The engineer's routine had been observed for weeks by intelligence operatives using satellite imagery and ground surveillance. Every morning at precisely 0630 local time, he would step onto the balcony for exactly 90 seconds to survey his domain. During that brief window, he would be exposed to long-range fire from several possible positions. Previous attempts to eliminate the target had failed for various reasons. A Special Forces raid had been compromised when their approach was detected by early warning systems. An airstrike had been ruled out due to the compound's location in a densely populated area. 2 previous sniper attempts had failed when the target changed his routine unexpectedly. Sarah understood the pressure she was under. This mission represented the culmination of months of planning and intelligence gathering. Failure would not only allow the engineer to continue his deadly work, but would likely result in him changing his security procedures permanently. Time check, she asked Webb quietly. 0625 local. Target should appear in 5 minutes. Webb continued scanning the approaches while maintaining communication with the command element monitoring the operation from a forward operating base 50 kilometers away. The radio crackled softly in Sarah's earpiece. Overwatch, this is command. Satellite imagery shows normal activity patterns in the target area. Weather conditions are optimal. You are cleared for engagement when target appears. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while running through final mental checks. Wind speed was steady at 6 knots from the northwest. Temperature was rising as the sun climbed higher, but thermal effects wouldn't become significant for another hour. Humidity was low, which would minimize atmospheric distortion of the bullet's path. Most importantly, she had identified the unique environmental factors that might affect this specific shot. The compound sat on a hillside that created Venturi effects with the prevailing wind. The target balcony was positioned where morning sun would create updrafts from heated concrete. And, at nearly 4,000 meters, even small atmospheric variations would be magnified dramatically. Movement on the balcony, Webb reported. Security sweep, 2 personnel. They're checking the perimeter. Sarah watched through her scope as 2 armed guards emerged onto the target balcony, scanning the surrounding landscape with binoculars. This was standard procedure that preceded the engineer's appearance. The guards would spend approximately 3 minutes examining potential threat positions before giving the all-clear signal. During her preparation, Sarah had studied every detail of the compound's security procedures. The guards always checked the same positions in the same order, following a pattern that had been observed dozens of times. Their predictability was both professional and potentially fatal. It meant that the engineer would appear in exactly the same location every time. Guards are withdrawing, Webb whispered. Target window opening in 60 seconds. Sarah controlled her breathing and settled deeper into her shooting position. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, perfectly balanced and familiar after thousands of hours of training. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, taking up just enough slack to feel the break point without applying pressure. The shot would require compensating for a complex array of variables. At 3,900 meters, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 4.5 seconds. During that time, it would travel through multiple wind layers, encounter thermal effects from the heated ground, and drop nearly 80 feet due to gravity. But the most challenging factor was the target himself. Unlike the stationary training target at Fort Bragg, the engineer would be moving during his brief appearance on the balcony. Intelligence reports indicated that he typically walked from the doorway to the railing, paused for observation, then returned inside. The entire sequence took exactly 90 seconds. Target appearing now, Webb announced, his voice tight with concentration. Through her scope, Sarah saw a figure emerge from the building's interior. The engineer was smaller than she had expected, dressed in traditional Afghan clothing that made him blend with the shadows of the balcony. He moved with the confidence of someone who felt secure in his stronghold, unaware that death was watching from nearly 4 kilometers away. Sarah tracked his movement, noting the pattern that intelligence had described. The target walked to the balcony's center, placed his hands on the railing, and began his daily survey of the valley. This was the moment when he remained stationary for approximately 20 seconds before beginning his return to the building's interior. The crosshairs settled on the target's center mass. Sarah began her final breathing sequence, slowing her heart rate to the point where she could fire between beats. Every muscle in her body relaxed except those necessary to maintain perfect shooting position. Wind steady, thermal effects minimal, Webb reported. Target stationary at the railing. Sarah's finger began applying pressure to the trigger. In the fraction of a second before the firing pin released, she made final mental calculations for the wind drift at different altitudes, the gradual warming of the air between her position and the target, and the slight movement of the target as he shifted his weight. The rifle thundered across the mountains, its report echoing through valleys and canyons for miles. Through the scope, Sarah watched the muzzle flash bloom and fade while beginning to track the bullet's path toward its distant target. For nearly 5 seconds, the fate of countless future operations hung in the balance as a single bullet crossed the space between life and death. The bullet's flight time at 3,900 meters seemed to stretch into eternity. Sarah maintained perfect position behind her rifle, tracking the trajectory through her scope even though the projectile was invisible at that distance. Years of experience had taught her to follow the bullet's path instinctively, reading wind indicators and atmospheric conditions along the entire route to the target. Time of flight, 4.7 seconds, Webb whispered, his own scope trained on the distant balcony. Target remained stationary at the railing. Through her scope, Sarah watched the engineer continue his daily survey of the valley, completely unaware that death was racing toward him at 2,700 feet per second. His casual posture and relaxed movements spoke of a man who felt absolutely secure in his remote stronghold, protected by distance and geography from any conventional threat. The bullet reached its apex at nearly 400 feet above the firing line before beginning its final descent toward the target. At 2,100 meters, it encountered the first significant wind layer, drifting slightly, but remaining within Sarah's calculated parameters. At 3,000 meters, thermal effects from the sun-heated valley floor created minor lift that she had anticipated and compensated for. Impact in 2 seconds. Webb counted down, his voice steady despite the tension. In the final 1,000 meters, the bullet's path took it through the most challenging atmospheric zone. Rising thermals from the heated compound walls created invisible air currents that could deflect even a perfectly aimed shot. But Sarah's calculations had accounted for these effects based on her observations of heat shimmer and the movement of dust particles around the target building. The impact was barely visible at that distance, a tiny disruption in the shadows of the balcony that lasted less than a fraction of a second. But through their high-powered scopes, both Sarah and Webb saw the unmistakable result. The engineer's body crumpled instantly, dropping below the balcony railing and out of sight. Target down, Webb reported into his microphone. Clean hit, target is down and motionless. Sarah maintained her position, continuing to observe the compound for signs of reaction from security forces. In her experience, successful shots were only the beginning of the most dangerous phase of an operation. Once the enemy realized they were under sniper attack, their response could be swift and overwhelming. Within 30 seconds, armed guards emerged from the building in obvious panic. They dragged the engineer's body from the balcony, while others began scanning the surrounding mountains with binoculars. Their movements were frantic and disorganized, suggesting that they had no idea where the shot had originated. "Command, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted. "Target eliminated with a single shot. Enemy forces are responding, but show no indication of having located our position." The radio crackled with the response from the command center. "Outstanding work, Overwatch. Begin exfiltration immediately." Satellite imagery shows enemy reaction forces mobilizing from multiple locations. Sarah began the methodical process of clearing her rifle and packing equipment. Every movement was deliberate and quiet, designed to leave no trace of their presence on the mountainside. Webb covered their withdrawal route while maintaining observation of the target compound and surrounding area. As they prepared to leave their hide site, Sarah reflected on the shot that had just changed the course of operations in eastern Afghanistan. The engineer had been responsible for innovations in IED technology that had killed and maimed hundreds of coalition forces. His elimination would disrupt bomb-making operations across the entire region. But, more than the tactical victory, Sarah understood the broader significance of what had just occurred. Her successful shot had validated the capabilities of female operators in the most demanding special operations roles. Every doubt and whispered comment about women in combat had been answered by a single bullet fired across nearly 4 kilometers of hostile territory. "Sarah, we need to move," Webb urged quietly. Drone surveillance shows enemy patrols beginning a grid search of possible sniper positions. They began their careful descent from the rocky outcropping, following a route that would take them to an extraction point 6 kilometers away. The terrain was treacherous, requiring them to move quickly while avoiding detection by increasing numbers of enemy searchers. 2 hours later, safely aboard a helicopter heading back to their forward operating base, Sarah finally allowed herself to process what she had accomplished. The radio chatter from the command center confirmed that intelligence agencies were already reporting disruption of enemy bomb-making activities across multiple provinces. "Lieutenant, that was one hell of a shot," the helicopter crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. "Word is already spreading about what you did out there. The ground units have been asking for weeks when someone could take out that target." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement, but remained focused on the mission debrief that awaited her return to base. Every detail of the operation would be analyzed and documented, adding to the institutional knowledge that would help future operations succeed. Webb sat beside her, cleaning his rifle with the same methodical precision. "You know, Sarah, I've worked with a lot of snipers over the years, but I've never seen anyone read environmental conditions the way you do. That shot today was pure artistry." "It was teamwork," Sarah replied. "Your spotting and security made the difference. In operations like this, no one succeeds alone." As the helicopter flew over the rugged Afghan landscape, Sarah thought about the phone call she would make to her grandfather that evening. He would want to hear every detail of the shot, not out of bloodthirst, but from professional appreciation for the skills he had helped develop during countless hours on hunting trips decades earlier. She also thought about the 9 elite snipers who had attempted the test shot at Fort Bragg 3 days earlier. Their failure had not been due to lack of skill or preparation, but because they had approached the problem using conventional thinking. Sometimes the most challenging problems required unconventional solutions. The mission's success would be classified for years, appearing in official reports only as target eliminated by long-range precision fire. But within the special operations community, word would spread about the Navy SEAL who had made an impossible shot when 9 of the military's finest marksmen had failed. More importantly, Sarah knew that her success had opened doors for other women who dreamed of serving in the most demanding military roles. The shot that had eliminated a terrorist leader had also shattered barriers that had existed for decades. As the forward operating base appeared on the horizon, Sarah began planning for her next mission. The war in Afghanistan was far from over, and there would be other targets that required the unique combination of patience, skill, and intuition that she had spent years developing. But, for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The impossible shot had been possible after all. Sometimes the difference between failure and success was simply a matter of seeing what others had missed and having the confidence to trust that vision when everything depended on a single moment of perfect execution. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and engine noise, but Sarah's mind was already focused on the future. There would be other missions, other impossible shots, and other opportunities to prove that excellence had no gender. In a profession where reputation was earned one bullet at a time, she had just written her name into legend with a shot that would be remembered long after the war itself became history.